Tonight we will discuss gun violence as a social, racial, and economic justice issue. We have a fine group of panelists who will lead us in that conversation. And let us come together tonight. Let us forge a new path. And most importantly, let us act after tonight. Let me have Bob Weisbord come up and tell you a little bit about Bob.
So a lot of work went into tonight by a lot of people, and I am really grateful to all of them, and particularly to Barbara and to all of you for being here. And I'm particularly honored to get to speak for a moment about Bob, who was a friend and mentor for 40 years. When this event was actually initially being planned, Bob was still alive, and we hoped he would be here for it. That obviously didn't happen, but it is a wonderful moment for all of us who've been planning it to see all of us gathered here to carry on his work. So we are really all gathered here tonight, and in fact enjoy many of the rights we enjoy today because of Robert Howard. If you dared to attend an event precisely like this one 30 years ago, you would have had a dossier in the infamous Red Squad files. As if that intimidation was not enough, the Red Squad was planning undercover agents and provocateurs to disrupt meetings like this one, to create violence like at the Democratic Convention in '68. And it was Bob and his colleagues who took on the Chicago Police Department, the US Army, the FBI, and the CIA, and successfully ended this political spying and harassment 30 years ago. If you were an airline stewardess in the 1970s, and you gained weight, or got married, or got pregnant, you got fired. It was Bob Howard and his colleagues who went to the US Supreme Court against 2 airlines to establish those fundamental rights for women. When Renault Robinson and Howard Saffold started the Afro-American Patrolmen's League to combat racism and police brutality in the Chicago police force, and by the way, for his troubles, Renault was reassigned to do the foot patrol in the alley behind the police headquarters. It was Bob who joined them to organize a citywide coalition and filed a class action on behalf of police brutality victims. As a result, we now have the Office of Professional Standards. And blacks went from being 10% of new hires at the police force in '73 to 40% in '75. When shortly after the first Mayor Daley died, a plurality of progressives took over the Chicago School Board and decided to stop fighting desegregation. It was Bob that the board hired to design and negotiate its first desegregation plan. That plan included massive promises of federal funding. Shortly thereafter, Ronald Reagan was elected and decided he wanted to eliminate the Department of Education. People have forgotten that. Eliminate the Department of Education and oppose all support for desegregation. It was Bob who led years of litigation and secured special legislation in Congress, went to the Supreme Court twice to hold the executive branch accountable and restore unprecedented funding to the Chicago schools. Whether representing Harold Washington in his first campaign for mayor, drafting a model ethics ordinance after he won, and then chairing its ethics board, helping reform the Chicago Housing Authority, winning major class actions to remedy housing and employment discrimination, or preventing segregation of Rockford schools, Bob was always passionate, fierce, and effective about justice. Yet, while bringing his remarkable intelligence and strength of personality, and many of you knew Bob, Bob was also unassuming, witty, and wise. It was always about the work and not about the person. He made the work engaging, spirited, collective, and creative. Bob remains an inspiration. He regularly shows us that it is possible to change the world, and that doing so can be a profoundly enjoyable endeavor. Bob was a mentor to scores of young attorneys and activists, including me. And his legacy is not just in the many groundbreaking cases he won, but in the movements and in the people he nurtured. And we continue his legacy with this symposium. Bob truly was one of those people bending the arc towards justice. While it is useful to remember how far we have come and that one person can make so much difference, Bob would not have us looking backwards or spending any more time on him. I can hear Bob pointing out that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. I can almost see the wheels turning as he thinks about ways to address gun violence and incarceration. Bob would have wanted to understand the dysfunction and injustice that we're about to explore tonight, and he would have been busy figuring out what to do about it. So with profound thanks to Bob Howard and to all of you who carry on this work, let us learn together tonight and let us go out and make a difference. Thank you.
I feel Bob Howard all up in this space. So, good evening, justice-seeking people of Chicago. My name is Beth Ritchie, and you can imagine how honored I feel to have been assigned the responsibility of introducing Angela Davis to you this evening. I'm, of course, very honored, but I also see this as a tremendous responsibility because, like many of you, we came tonight not just to celebrate and honor Bob Howard's life, not just to hear another great speech from Angela Davis, which we'll certainly do, not just to hear the wisdom and the on-the-ground work of this panel. It's another politically glorious moment in Chicago. But it's also true that we came because we have serious justice-making work to do in Chicago. And Angela Davis has a lot to tell us about that, probably more than anybody else at this critical moment. She has a lot to remind us of about how we need to change our neighborhoods, what's wrong with our government, how to modify our relationships in our families, how to change or transform our institutions, how to reignite a sense of values, how to change our priorities, to think about what our strategies are. Indeed, Angela Davis helps us get refocused, doesn't she, when she comes to town? She reminds us how serious this work is. She's a scholar activist, an author of far too many books and articles and blogs and manifestos to name. They range, as you know, from Black feminist texts to historical books to her own autobiography. She's a teacher, professor emeritus in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a wise international diplomatic radical peacemaker, and goodness knows we need someone to be talking about peace tonight, so peace might prevail. Angela Davis has been writing and teaching and talking and thinking and working with us, for us, alongside of us for years. Working with us as we strive to build a justice-loving community that she talks about. Working with us as she models how to do our work with a sense of indignation about the brutality of injustice, challenging us to fundamentally change the world. She's done that as a prison abolitionist, a visionary founder of critical resistance. She's done that as a feminist activist, one of the first Black feminist activists to talk about the linkages between gender violence, the constraints of heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity, and the neoliberal punishment industry all lining up together. She does that as a generous, intergenerational advocate for the leadership of younger people who are here with us tonight. And she's done that raising up the voices of those most affected by the complex problems that our panel is going to bring forward to us this evening. For me personally, Angela has been a deep inspiration for my work, both because of her steadfast political commitments that I lean on, that I draw from, that I try to pull up when the knees start to shake, but also because of how she grounds those political commitments in real work, on real issues, in real time. She shows up and speaks out. She stands firmly, often humbly, but always with compassion for those struggling for justice and peace. And I honor her not only for her commitments, but how she makes them come alive in her work. Angela Davis, dear sister and comrade, I welcome you on behalf of the young leaders who you met with today. I welcome you on behalf of the peacemakers that will be on our panel. and on behalf of the justice-seeking people in Chicago who are here tonight to absorb some of your wisdom. I welcome you somewhat inappropriately maybe, but for all of those communities around the city of Chicago, who am I to speak for them, but they know that their lives are different because of the work that you've done. We're all beneficiaries of your political commitments and of your work real time. And of course, I welcome you again in the memory of Bob Howard and the work that he did. Angela, I thank you deeply and personally for your inspiring leadership and vision, and for the ways that you are indeed bending the arc towards justice. Angela Davis.
First of all, let me thank you, Beth, for the absolutely wonderful introduction. And let me express my gratitude to the organizers of this symposium, to Barbara Phillips, Crossroads Foundation, and the organizing committee for what I think will be an annual Robert Howard Memorial Symposium. And I too am sorry that Bob did not live to participate in this first symposium. But knowing about all of his amazing accomplishments, and you've heard about them in a nutshell this evening, and I'm thinking especially of the work he did to improve access to education. We know that his work, his dedication, his commitment, his passion made it possible for us to do the work we do today. So let me say thank you, Bob Howard, and thank you, Barbara, for inviting me to participate in this event. I'd like also to thank the bishop and the dean and the associate dean of the cathedral. I was saying that actually I feel very much at home in an Episcopal church because my father used to be a lay reader. And I think this is the place that should encourage social justice activism. I had this wonderful meeting with a number of the young people who are sitting over there in the choir this afternoon, and I was rather frustrated because it had to end so quickly. But let me tell you, they should really be the ones speaking to you this evening. And I think we should keep in mind that it is young people who reap the fruits of past struggles and who take those struggles places that those of us who engaged in the initial movements could have hardly imagined. I actually want to begin by referring to a film, which I think you all saw. Did you see the documentary about my trial? It's a film that's called Free Angela and All Political Prisoners. Some of you may have seen it. And as some of you may know, I was tried on 3 charges back in the early 1970s, all of which carried the death penalty. And the pretext for those charges was the fact that I owned guns that were used at a courthouse in Northern California in an attempt by Jonathan Jackson to free his brother George and 2 other Soledad brothers. And I I raise this because this is a symposium about gun violence. And many people ask me, well, how do you feel about guns today? You owned guns in the past. And let me say that if I recall the conversations around guns and gun violence during that period, it was primarily about racist violence. It was Black people talking about the need for guns as a way of asserting our right to self-defense. It is not accidental that the Black Panther Party was first called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, following the Deacons for Defense in Louisiana, and following the lead of Robert Williams, who was an NAACP leader in North Carolina, who stood up to the Ku Klux Klan with guns. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called Negroes with Guns. And I was speaking about my father a moment ago, and I also recall that my father kept guns in the house. And as a matter of fact, there were many occasions when the Ku Klux Klan was lurking around. I lived on Dynamite Hill. Our neighborhood was called Dynamite Hill because so many of the homes that Black people had purchased were bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. And as I was telling the young people today, my very first organized political involvement, I believe, was a discussion group that took place in my church. It was Congregational church. My mother was Congregationalist, my father was Episcopalian. And we had an interracial discussion group among young people in the church. Within a very short period of time, the church was burned. That was down the street from 2 blocks from our house. We were challenging the assumption that racist violence and state violence could prevent us from achieving freedom and equality. And I should say that during those days, some of us also saw ourselves challenging the nonviolent approaches that were prevalent in the civil rights movement, whose foremost advocates, of course, were Dr. Martin Luther King and others. And I think I might say today that we naively tended to see armed self-defense as an answer to the pervasive violence of that era, especially the violence inflicted on freedom movement activists. But of course, it wasn't so simple. The activists who engaged in nonviolent action were far more courageous than so many people who advocated picking up the gun. This is another conversation that we can pursue at another time. I seem to make it to Chicago rather regularly these days. Beth was referring to when she comes to town. But the point I want to make is that there was a political context for our position. We were inspired by Frantz Fanon, who argued that Africa had to be decolonized. We were inspired by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, who were principal figures in the struggle that led to the Cuban Revolution. We were inspired by Nelson Mandela and Umkhonto Sizwe. And of course, many people forget that there was a time when Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list in the US. We were inspired by Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and by Agostinho Neto of the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, and this is just to name a few. We saw ourselves as engaging in revolutionary struggles that were linked to the decolonization of Africa, the decolonization of Asia. We identified with the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, as opposed to the US military forces that represented the continued imperialist impulse of that era. And even with all of the violence that we confronted, and I can tell you stories about being called at 5 o'clock in the morning by members of the Black Panther Party in LA who said that they were surrounded by what turned out to be the first appearance of a SWAT squad, and how the police stormed their offices. But again, those are stories for another time. The point that I want to make is that even with all of the violence we confronted, and in many ways it felt like we were under siege during that time. And of course, those of you who are old enough to have experienced that era here in Chicago, you remember Fred Hampton and the attacks on people who were simply struggling for justice. But even with all of this violence, homicide was not the leading cause of young Black men. Gun violence had not reached epidemic proportions, and the political context within which guns are legitimated, which is now a right-wing conservative context, was very different. Speaking about Chicago in the 70s, we also know that Chicago has been the site of much discussion about gun violence, especially since the tragic death of Hadiya Pendleton last January. But unfortunately, the solutions that tend to be offered often involve more guns and more violence. It has been pointed out that here in Chicago, some 47 people were shot and 9 killed over Father's Day weekend. And that 9 people were shot and killed over the weekend of July 4th. And in response to this, there have been calls for more armed police. That is to say, more guns, more violence, in order to combat violence. Even though I have emphasized the way the discussion on guns during that era, guns and violence during that era, diverged from the discussion we are having today, there is a rhetorical strategy that was used during that era, one that led to many important insights and perhaps should not have been considered only rhetorical. And this might be helpful today. You know, I can remember calls for gun control. And many of us said, yes, as a matter of fact, let's take guns away from everybody. And especially from the police. Especially. I mean, just imagine what the planet would be like if no one had guns. If we could disarm the military and disarm all police forces and disarm civilians as well. Well, in those days we said that you can't simply take guns away from civilians and solve the problem. As a matter of fact, more guns in anyone's hands, whether they be the police or not, lead to more guns and lead to more violence. And right now, it is absolutely astounding that in this country, there is approximately 1 gun per resident. That is to say, some 300 million guns, which amounts to something like 94.3 guns per 100 people. Now, that's insane, isn't it? And as a matter of fact, I think we should consider that statistic in relation to the statistic that was just evoked earlier, that the U.S. has 25% of the incarcerated population, while only 5% of the population of the world. There's a relationship between this drive towards mass incarceration and the epidemic of gun violence. If you compare the numbers of guns in this country to the numbers of guns in Palestine, how many guns do you think there are in Palestine proportionally? It's actually, okay, we said for the US, it's 94.3 for every 100 residents. In Palestine, which is so often evoked as the site of violence par excellence, and Palestinians are terrorists, right? In Palestine, it's 3.4 guns for every 100 residents. Now you tell me where the violence emanates from. In Ghana, I just recently made a trip to Ghana a couple of months ago, and it's 0.4% per every 100 inhabitants. Now, there's something wrong with living in a country that represents itself as the model of democracy in the world, that has more people in prison and more prisons than any other country in the world, and that has more guns than any other country in the world. Isn't that do you find that contradictory? Is that kind of bizarre? But of course we should talk about the larger culture of violence and how we have become inured to the representations of violence, of cinematic violence and televisual violence. One of the lessons we've learned from feminist theorists and activists, from people like Beth Ritchie and Kathy Cohen and others, is that if we want to understand any phenomenon, we have to strive to grasp the connections that link it to other issues, especially those that may seem to have no relation at all to the issue at hand. It used to be said that gender had nothing to do with race. I don't know, maybe some of you are old enough to remember that era. Fortunately, the young people don't have to deal with that today, not as much at least. It used to be said that sexuality had nothing to do with class. But we have learned that race is always gendered, sexuality is always class, for example. And so how do we go further? We often assume that gang violence has nothing to do with police violence, or that police violence has nothing to do with domestic violence or intimate violence, or that the violence that consumed the lives of the 4 young girls in Birmingham 50 years ago on September 15th, that violence has nothing to do with the violence that consumes the lives of young people of color today. I would like us to reflect on the relationship between violence and a pervasive inability to imagine the future. In many ways, violence is a solution that isolates the present from the future. Or so it's a solution that precludes future possibilities, whether we're talking about economic future, cultural future of a community, or the future of a family, whatever its configuration may be. 50 years after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church by the Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham, Alabama, we can say that the Klan, along with government collusion, because we know that the FBI had infiltrated the Klan and knew about the bombing before it happened, but we can say that they not only violently destroyed the lives of Carol and Denise and Addie Mae and Cynthia, because they couldn't imagine a future that might be defined by racial equality. They destroyed those who were charged with creating a more habitable future for Black communities. And in a sense, you can say that that violence was inflicted because of an inability to imagine a future that would be better for all of us. Black and Latino youth who today assume that the only way to protect themselves is to carry weapons are only abstractly protecting themselves. They may see themselves as defending bodies, people, turf, whatever, but they're not defending a future. As critical as we might be today about the focus on weapons within the Black liberation movement of the 60s and 70s and the Chicano movement and the Native American movement of that period, at least we saw ourselves as safeguarding a future. We had a collective vision of a future without racism, without capitalism, where education would be available to all. Some people went about it in the wrong way, but that does not mean that that vision of a future was not the animating force. And of course, here in Chicago, it is so clear that the attacks on education, the closing down of schools, the lack of respect for teachers and for their union this is linked to the violence that erupts in Black and brown communities. You know, it used to be the case that teachers were on the front line of the struggle against violence. And they could be effective because they armed their students with an ability to imagine a better world. A world where poverty might one day become an anachronism, where racial and gender equality might prevail, where the society would have been purged of homophobia and transphobia. And so it is so sad to hear that so many young people cannot imagine themselves living beyond their teens. Now, there have been moments of promise that have perhaps given us a glimpse of what it might mean to inhabit a society that is not so pervaded with violence. And I'm thinking back to the first inauguration of Barack Obama. That seems like it was a long, long time ago, doesn't it? It wasn't that long ago. But I remember that it was said that during the actual inauguration, not a single crime was committed in Washington, D.C. Now that's amazing, isn't it? And this was a moment when vast numbers of people all over the country and all over the world, in fact, understood the historical import of that moment, the convergence of past struggles and present struggles that produce this momentary but collective vision of the future. And unfortunately, we didn't act on that vision. Had we been able to move forward and build a more powerful movement, we might have captured the imaginations of so many young people whose lives have been claimed by gun violence. And I can tell you, I can remember witnessing amazing transformations among young Black people who decided to join the Black Panther Party. And I was talking to the young people in the meeting earlier today and reminiscing about kids who did not know how to read and write because they had not been taught. And we thought the educational system was really bad then. It's even worse today. But I was telling them that I remember teaching a class over the course of 10 weeks or so. And it was a class on Lenin's State and Revolution. And there were these kids who did not know how to read, but they struggled with that text with dictionaries. They read many, many pages, and they were absorbed by it. And, they imagined themselves as actors in a revolution that was going to overturn capitalism. And they realized that if they were going to do that, they definitely had to learn how to read and write. Now, what we did not accomplish, how many years ago was it? 6 years ago? Helps us to create agendas for today. Now, what is the best way to eliminate violence? First of all, we can never purge our societies of violence if we only focus on the perpetrators as the cause of that violence. And we are encouraged to focus myopically on the agents of violence, on the perpetrators, whether it's the police, or whether it's the George Zimmermans, or whether it's gang members, or whether it's youth who carry guns because they feel obliged to do so, or whether it's men or women who inflict violence on their intimate partners, whether it's people who inflict homophobic violence on members of LGBTQ communities, whether it's parents who inflict violence on their children, whether it's adults who sexually molest children who are relatives or children of friends. It is often said that kids learn how to be violent from their parents. And that's probably true. But where did the parents learn? And how has violence become so naturalized? So much so that we've often failed to make connections between the way children used to be disciplined in school, and they still are disciplined in some schools, and the way they're disciplined in jail. The prison industrial complex is violence rendered legitimate by the law. And the connection between torture and what goes on a daily basis in this country's jails and prisons is something that we have refused to acknowledge. Even when we saw the evidence in for example, the revelations around Abu Ghraib. I'm suggesting that we think about these connections, not in order to detract from the very specific ways in which violence is manifested, but rather to point out that often the solutions that are proposed to violence are in many ways the very causes that are responsible for violence in our communities in the first place. Feminists have long pointed out that it is assumed, if it is assumed that the best way to challenge violence against women is by subjecting the perpetrators to the structural violence of imprisonment, ultimately, this putative solution only exacerbates the problem, because prison makes people even more violent than they were when they were arrested. And this is a large conversation. I mean, it's a historical conversation. We would have to talk about the roots of violence and slavery. I think we may eventually realize, and this will probably take a very long time, that the industrialization of food production, in which animals are raised in order to kill them, and this culture of amnesia, which makes people unaware of the fact that they're eating dead animals, is problematic. I mean, I'm not criticizing people who eat meat, although I wish fewer people did eat meat. What I'm criticizing is a culture that makes us utterly unaware of what we are doing, and thus prevents the development of more humane, less violent modes of, say, food production. But there is a link between the unconsciousness that characterizes our eating habits and the unconsciousness regarding the vast numbers of people in prison. It's better to simply not think about it. So I know I've opened up a lot of issues, but I'm simply trying to urge you to think in broad terms and to ask, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want? And what are we willing to do in order to usher that world into being? Do we really want a world without racism, without sexism, without homophobia and transphobia, without attacks on immigrants, without violence or war, without attacks on disabled people, without the destruction of plant and animal life on this planet? If that is what we want, we have to recognize that there are no short-term solutions to these problems. I find that the more capitalism commodifies all aspects of our lives, the more we have to teach ourselves to think beyond the moment. We get totally caught up in this fast food society in which we want instant solutions for everything. We have to think beyond the moment. beyond the decade, and also beyond the century. And many of us don't want to think about what the world is going to be like when we're no longer here. Because somehow or another, the world only makes sense if we are part of it. But of course, that individualistic, I'll use a philosophical term, solipsistic, you can look that up, way of imagining oneself in the world is very dangerous. It's very dangerous. And racism is still with us, largely, because too many of us have assumed that it could be wished away. Colorblindness, remember colorblindness? Violence is still with us because we fail to acknowledge the depth of its roots in our histories, in our cultures, in our families, and in our own psyches. If we are interested in the future, our collective futures, we will have to be willing to think long and hard, and to work long and hard for solutions that can gradually begin to change the way we as human beings inhabit this earth. This is the beginning of a conversation, and I've come to the end of my 30 minutes. So let me just say, we're all in this together, and there's no question about it. We have to make a change. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jean Crocker, and I'm on the staff of the Crossroads Fund. And I have the honor of introducing our moderator of our panel tonight, Cheryl Corley. So let me say a few words about Cheryl. Cheryl Corley is an NPR correspondent who works for the National Desk and is based in Chicago. She travels throughout the Midwest, covering issues and events throughout the region's 12 states. In recent years, among many stories, Cheryl has covered the campaign and re-election of President Barack Obama, the efforts by Illinois officials to rethink the state's juvenile justice system, and youth violence in Chicago. Additionally, she reported on the infamous Trayvon Martin shooting case in Florida, covered tornadoes that have destroyed homes and claimed lives in the Midwest, and was among the group of NPR reporters covering the devastation caused by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita as they tore through the Gulf Coast. As well as being a correspondent, Cheryl has served as a fill-in host for NPR shows, and prior to joining NPR, Cheryl was the news director at WBEZ here in Chicago. Cheryl has received numerous awards, including the Community Media Workshop Studs Turkle Award for excellence in reporting on Chicago's diverse communities. A Chicagoan true and true, Cheryl graduated cum laude from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and is now a Bradley University trustee. And I will say that Cheryl is one of the best friends in journalism and one of the most thorough journalists out there covering issues all across the city and the nation, and a great friend to all of us on this stage. To the Crossroads Fund, thank you for doing this tonight, Cheryl Corley.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's really an honor to be here with everyone tonight. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Toni Precwinkle taught me that when she was saying answering everybody who said good evening. I said, well, we got to get the crowd into this too, right? Well, it's really an honor to commemorate the life and work of Bob Howard, and to hear from our guest speaker, Angela Davis, whose life story made such an impact on me growing up, and others in the audience, I'm sure, as well. And to talk about the violence that our city faces and the efforts of some really dedicated people that we are going to hear from tonight. So a short breakdown. We're going to hear from our panelists. I'll ask a few questions. Then I will give you a chance to ask questions of them as well. All of us in this room, I consider us part of a club. We have heard the stories. Many of us live in or near a city that has drawn national headlines and international headlines for murder and violence. We know some of the names. Angela Davis mentioned Hadia Pendleton, shot at a park not far from Barack Obama's Chicago home. There, of course, was Blair Holt, shot on a bus protecting another student. Darian Albert, whose death was caught on videotape. Shirley Chambers, the mother who lost all 4 of her children to gun violence. And local newspapers, we open them up, they track them every day, the murders of those not as well known, mostly young people, one by one. For decades, Chicago has tried to get rid of its Al Capone reputation of violence. But not too long ago, an HBO show described Chicago as Chirac. The city has also been called Chiganistan. Funny, isn't it? Or maybe not. And a late-night political satirist talking about Syria recently said, if America cared about shooting people, we'd be invading Chicago. All of those labels condition how we and others think about the city. We know that in some neighborhoods, guns and violence are a daily reality, and in other neighborhoods, it's a concept that's almost foreign. And despite the spotlight on Chicago, police tell us that murders and shootings were actually down in the city for the 6 months of this year, compared with the same periods of the past 2 years. Even so, the violence in some of our neighborhoods brings a barrage of tears, questions, fears, plus efforts to turn it around and to turn that depiction of Chirac around. It makes us consider not only what seems to be senseless so many times to some of us, but also for some of us, what's good in our neighborhoods, what can work in those neighborhoods, how restorative justice and peace work are not just necessary, but viable. That's a vision that the people on this panel have. It's a vision they share. People who've taken on the responsibility to fight for justice to get to peace. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them individually before they each speak, but they are collectively Amina Matthews, Henry Cervantes, Ryan Holland, and I'll get the correct name, Ryan, and Miriam Kaba, and Toni Precwinkle. Let's give them all a round of applause. We're going to start this evening with Toni Precwinkle, and most of you here know who she is, but just a few little facts about her. Toni Precwinkle, of course, the president of the Cook County Board. She was a Chicago alderman for several years, where she was known for her independent stance at City Hall. She fought for more funding for education and affordable housing in her ward. She sponsored a living wage ordinance. Board President Precwinkle has also been a high school history teacher in Chicago. She ran an organization aimed at neighborhood improvement. She's also known for her advocacy against police brutality and excessive force, and in support of reforming mandatory minimum sentencing. So, President Precwinkle, I'm just going to have you begin by giving us your reflections of the speech that Angela Davis gave this evening.
So first of all, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Let me talk a little bit broadly about criminal justice in this country. Let me go back to an important fact that we should all remember, which Professor Davis alluded to. And that is that we have 5% of the world's population, roughly 315 million people. We have 25% of the people in the entire world who are detained or incarcerated. 25%. That's an astonishing figure and reflects very badly on this country. The reason our incarceration and detention rates are so astronomical is that we detain an incredible number of black and brown young people. If you look at our juvenile temporary detention center, 99% of the young people there are black and brown. In our adult jail, 86% of our population is black or brown. On any given day, we have about 10,000 people in our jail. Only 10% of them are serving a sentence. 90% are awaiting trial. They're pretrial detainees. In our criminal justice system, you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. But 90% of the people in our jail are pretrial detainees. Of those pretrial detainees, 70% are awaiting trial for nonviolent offenses. 70%. So what I usually say is the jail is at the intersection of racism and poverty in this country. And clearly the African American and Latino communities are disproportionately impacted in our criminal justice system at every juncture. If you look at African American and Latino communities, young people standing out on the corner are more likely to be stopped by the police. If they're stopped by the police, they're more likely to be taken to the station as opposed to told to go home. It's over curfew or whatever. If they go to the station, they're much more likely to enter our criminal justice system than have their parents called and have what we call a station adjustment. And a couple years ago, the Black Caucus of the state legislature commissioned a study on drug offenses. And they looked at African Americans and whites who had similar backgrounds for low-level drug offenses. And in the state of Illinois, the African American defendants were 5 times more likely to go to jail. And in the county of Cook, 8 times more likely. Similar backgrounds. So we have a criminal justice system that detains and incarcerates large numbers of African American and Latino young men and has extraordinarily disparate outcomes for them once their cases are adjudicated. So we have some tremendous challenges. We've been working, and Kim Fox on my staff is here today. I'm grateful for her presence. We've been working very hard to try to figure out how we can reduce our pretrial detainee population in the jail, the nonviolent offenders. I'm not talking about those accused of violent crimes, but let me remind you, you could be accused of murder, and as long as you can pay your bail, you're out on the street. So it's not necessarily those who are accused of the most serious crimes who are in our jail. It's those who do not have the resources to pay their bond who are in our jail. So we're working very hard to try to figure out how we can impact this situation. We've put resources for the first time in the county into anti-violence and anti-recidivism initiatives. We're looking forward to ways to try to increase support for those initiatives. But the overall challenge we face is that not all the actors in the criminal justice arena share my view that it's a great injustice to detain so many people pre-trial, and as a result, our efforts to reduce the jail population have not gone as well as I might have hoped. But we're going to do our best to continue to work on that, reduce the number of pretrial detainees who are accused of nonviolent crimes in our jail, and look at alternatives for detention for them. Because what we have to remember is that whatever you do, whether it's sending somebody to a drug treatment program or sending them to supportive housing with behavioral health services, putting somebody in day reporting so they go to the jail during the day, they get support for their addiction, and often it's addiction that brings people into our jail, our criminal justice system. In the morning, and then education and training in the afternoon, all those things which provide people with an opportunity to turn their lives around and a path to productivity are cheaper than the $143 a day it costs. The $143 a day it costs to keep somebody in jail. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's challenging, but I'm hopeful that we're at a point in this country where those who come at this issue from a social justice perspective and those who come at it from a fiscal responsibility perspective, given the fact that we spend in Cook County alone $500 million a year on our jail, are coming together to look at alternatives to detention for nonviolent pretrial detainees in a way that has not been the case in the past. So, thank you.
Well, we radio people know to move to working microphones. So we did a little choosing of who is going to go next, and Henry Cervantes is both an artist and an activist who has led several initiatives addressing violence in Chicago neighborhoods, including Pilsen and Little Village, where he grew up. He is the Chicago Peace Works Coordinator for Marquette University's Center of Peacemaking. He develops nonviolence education curriculum for both public and private schools. Henry also does trainings on restorative justice and conflict resolution for youth and youth development professionals from around the world. And he also organizes annual youth forums on preventing violence and promoting peace. Henry Cervantes.
Buenas noches. Good evening. I just want to start off by expressing my gratitude for being here today. I'm very grateful and humbled to be sitting with people who I've learned a lot from, and I consider myself a student of your work. And thanks again to Crossroads for extending the invitation. I kind of just wanted to mention a couple of things in reference to where I grew up. And so how many of you are familiar with Pilsen or Little Village? Raise your hand. We're in the South Lawndale area on the Lower West Side. Welcome anytime. It's a great place, wonderful place to live in. I'm very proud to be from that community. One of the issues that our community faces is this gun violence issue. Pilsen and Little Village, we have the highest concentration of young people than any other place in the city of Chicago. And over the past couple of years, we've had the homicide rates increase in our communities. And, I grew up in these communities, and I want to mention, too, that I grew up without a father who I just met, and he turns out that he's a very violent person. And I've been given the responsibility of being the eldest brother to 6 sisters. I didn't choose peace work. I think it was an obligation that all of us have. We have an obligation to our community. We have an obligation to our country to advocate for the well-being of everybody. And it's interesting how I've been pulled into this kind of work. What I think needs to be done to confront the gun violence issue, more than just the policy level, is working with the local people on the ground. And part of what I try to do at the schools is teach the strategies and tactics of nonviolent resistance that have existed for ages. And I think that, there's a lot of anger in our communities. There's a lot of anger in the west side of Chicago. There's a lot of anger in the south side of Chicago. A lot of young people are angry. And it's understandable why so many young people are angry. They're getting locked up, they're closing down their schools, and they have no other access to resources. So the anger is understandable. So how do we harness that anger to address some of the issues that they're angry about and funnel it into nonviolent resistance and nonviolent movements? So that's part of the work that I'm trying to do. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Miriam Kaba. She's an organizer and educator whose work focuses on three things: ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, and supporting youth leadership development. Miriam is the founding director of Project NIA. It's a grassroots organization with the long-term goal of ending youth incarceration in Illinois. She's been a program officer for education and youth development at the Steens Family Foundation. She's also co-founded several other organizations, including the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women. Miriam Kaba.
I'm at risk of spending my limited time speechless, staring admiringly at Dr. Davis, but I'm told that that's unacceptable. So here we are, and we'll say a few words. I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me, for being part of this great panel with a lot of people that I admire and work with and have so much to learn from. I'm especially humbled to be part of honoring the legacy of Bob Howard. My gratitude for Barbara for carrying on their commitment to social justice. So this is really great. My comments tonight are centered on the insidious and for far too many invisible violence deployed under the pretext of ending gun and other forms of violence and crime in our communities and in our neighborhoods. I've lived here in Chicago since 1995. I have never experienced a summer like I have this one. For us, in our community, the summer kicked off with intense, relentless, and surely illegal police harassment of young people, specifically young people of color, young people riding their bikes on sidewalks. Instead of being ticketed, were hauled into police lockups, where they were accused of resisting arrest, and then funneled into Cook County Jail, where preparations began in April to make room for such egregious arrests. Young people leaving a program that we incubate called Circles and Ciphers were followed by cop cars, asked where they are heading. One crossword leads to being roughly thrown on police car hoods in front of the whole entire neighborhood. Walking through alleys as a shortcut to head home from work, young men are hounded, provoked, dragged to the station, but not before being beaten in the car without any concern for health conditions like seizures. On the west side, colleagues and friends shared stories and have continuously continued to share stories of young people being picked up without cause, driven into rival territory, where they are dumped without wallets and phones, only to hear the cops announcing loudly that they belong to the rival gang. Those young people tried to make their way home in one piece. Then there was the friend who has been incarcerated for years and now is working to support young men so that they don't end up locked up, who was pulled off a city bus by the feds, taken home, his apartment ransacked, looking for what we still don't know. All of this state violence happening out of public view, under the guise of ending violence, gun violence, a reminder that we live in at least 2 different cities. It should be no surprise then that in a peace circle that I ran last January after Sandy Hook with young black youth ages 15 to 18, that the idea of gun control was met with skepticism by some and with complete derision by the others. All 14 youth in the circle had been victims of gun violence. In the absence, to me, of a serious discussion about US militarism and police violence, it seems unlikely that any efforts at disarming the populace will gain a popular foothold. Because while the NRA didn't call for young black men to arm themselves after Trayvon Martin's killing, Dr. Martha Biondi has recently written about their efforts to win converts on the south side of Chicago. So where does this all leave us? We can't have an honest conversation about gun violence in America while the police become increasingly militarized and our military polices the entire globe using drones to kill brown-skinned innocents with impunity. We have to connect these dots between militarism, wholesale economic disinvestment, and its resulting poverty, racism, empire building, if we're to have any chance at all to effectively address interpersonal violence at the community level. Because after all, structural violence is the mirror of the interpersonal violence that we're seeing in our communities. And so, for me to end, I want to say a word on behalf of the young people who I know and love and care about. The notion that we are living in, quote, Chirac is so incredibly insane and so damaging. Not because I don't think people's lived experiences of feeling under siege are valuable, but because you have to ask yourself the question of what is the logical consequence of calling our city a war zone. Because America doesn't intervene in our city with peace circles if it's a city at war. America intervenes in our cities with more cops, more guns, Humvees, tanks from the Defense Department, and other kinds of war machinery. So the more we embrace these kinds of conceptions and the more comedians who know nothing about our city paint these pictures about our city, the more of the kids that I love and care about are the targets of a militarized police force and more and more and more violence. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Amina Matthews, is constantly on call trying to keep violence from escalating in neighborhoods where she works. She is a senior violence interrupter with Ceasefire Illinois, a University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health Violence Prevention project. She has dedicated her life and her career to peace building and social change, and she works to mediate conflict on the front end. And she and 2 co-workers are the subjects of an award-winning documentary some of you might have seen titled The Interrupters. Amina Matthews.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me? Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. I thank you guys so very much for inviting for this discussion that we've had countless times. What I feel is now it's time for action. Because we definitely know, President, we know what the problem is. My job and my purpose, as the brother said, we had not been, I know I didn't really, for real, when I went to Ceasefire, it's now formally, it's called Cure Violence formerly known as Ceasefire, Illinois, I did not fill out an application. It was a great need for violence interrupters. My goal and my job, my purpose, and my vision, as Dr. Davis speak about, for the future in dealing with the young men and women that I deal with and those that are in the room today is to make sure that they're in sound mind so I can get that pension when they press yes on that voting ticket when it's time for them to vote. So as a violence interrupter, I stop the transmission of violence from one person to another. Violence, I do believe, is a learned behavior. However, real quickly, when I was raised, and who raised me is in this room today, and her words were very adamant that if somebody hit you, you hit them back. Now what we're seeing is, because when I was growing up, it was a fair, square fight. Win, lose, or draw, and if you lose, you go home and you tighten your skills up on your little brother or your little cousin, and then you come out and get ready for the next one, 2 o'clock after school. But what we haven't seen back in the days of as I was growing up is brothers and sisters losing their lives at 10 o'clock in the morning, and while young babies coming home from school trying to get in from elementary. My job and my purpose is, as I was stating this, to stop the transmission of violence from one person to another using weapons of mass destruction. My job and my purpose is to get to the young guys and the young girls before they cross the line to law enforcement, to educate them on how it's gonna be once they get into that institution where my dad has been for the last 30 years, man. My job is to identify those that are high risk, that tend to think and believe that they're leaders on the block because they feel like they have to arm themselves against, may it be the police, or may it be against the block, or may it just be against the survival or lack of resources, man, to make a major decision between, do I get this meat for my mom to cook with, or do I go and arm myself because I know that I gotta get to school the next day, and the school that I go to is out of the district of what I have known of my heartbeat to grow in, as far as the way people do things when they close the schools down. So my goal here is for us to come to some solutions. My name is Amina. My name is, and I have an attribute that means trustworthy and patient. I got the trustworthy down. Patience, I'm working on it, and I need you all, as they say, the bishop where you at, to pray for me. But it is a need for us, and yes, when I was growing up, we are angry today, brother, but we're no angrier than when we were growing up, because my grandmother's in this room, and she was a single grandmother at the age of 30-something, raising me when she could have put me in a system. However, if I walked in a room of adults and didn't speak, I was picking up my teeth off the ground. So therefore, we do have work to be done to go back a little bit to bring up to the future. So I am to identify, detect, and to stop the transmission of violence from one person to another. Do I deal with law enforcement? They're a part of the model of the component that we work with. Do I share any information from block to block, street to street, friend to friend, emotion to emotion? Absolutely not. But we have to have the conversation, like the president said, about what is going on in our city of Chicago, which is no different than what's going on in our nation. I am a resident of Chicago, Illinois, not Chirac, babies. But however, it may seem at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 10 o'clock at night to midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning that we hearing these weapons of mass destruction bussing, are we scared to get up the next day to make it to school? That's what parents say to their children because it may be a war. So as I continue my journey, we have to continue to remember, you guys, that my husband uses this all the time here in the room, but I'm gonna use this stuff today. It's a reason why the sperm hit the egg. It's a reason why Amina is Amina. It's the reason why we sitting here. And it's not for us to hurt each other. It's for us as a movement. This is a movement right here. This is a movement right here. We got the young guys, we got the middle guys, we got the older guys somewhere up in there that's with me, and well, this is a movement that we can stop this insanity of gun violence, of weapons of mass destruction against our young guys and girls. So as we continue moving around and questions that you all have, that we really can answer our own questions. Why? Where? And when? That's the questions that we can ask. So that's what I do, and I am so grateful to Crossroads. I'm so grateful to the civil rights lawyer, Brother Bob. May Allah be pleased with him and his efforts that he has looked upon that police brutality, black on black crime. See, this is not just, as we heard the sister here say, the president say that it's a difference between Latinos and blacks when they get in a room or in the presence of law enforcement. So when we're dealing with all of that hostile lack of resources, lack of schools, poor education, our teachers are being moved over this way and our children are moved over that way, and it's a gap in the middle. Where's the spirituality in all of this? That's what we have to really understand about why. So thank you guys, and we can continue this conversation to action, I would definitely hope. Because I'm tired of talking about this. We got work to do. We got work to do. Let's go.
Our next speaker in the panel is Ryan Lugalia Holland. He is finishing his PhD in urban planning, and his focus is on mass incarceration and neighborhood safety. He is the co-executive director of the YMCA of Metro Chicago's Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Strategy. He's also a founding board member of the Community Justice for Youth Institute. He's worked as an anti-violence program evaluator for Northwestern and at the University of Illinois Chicago as a director of field operations on a study of low-wage working conditions. Ryan Lugalia Holland.
So I want to say thank you to really the generation of leaders that organized tonight and that have also been holding up the Crossroads Fund. I feel like it's a testament as much as anything to the power of enduring friendship. So I hope that we all get that out of the experience tonight. One of the driving questions, maybe the driving question in much of my work on the ground and my thought, my intellectual work, is how do we make neighborhoods safe without locking everybody up? I think that's something we have to figure out as a society. And in order to get there, we also have to ask the question, why is it that we lock up so many people, right? And we've heard the statistics about 5% of the world's population, a quarter of the world's prison population. And there's a lot of great thinkers, a lot of great leaders working on that particular question. Obviously, the young lady who spoke earlier, Angela Davis, is working on that question. Beth Ritchie works on that question. Miriam Kaba works on that question. Michelle Alexander works on that question. The one thing I want to add to that discussion is that I really feel that mass incarceration represents tremendous work avoidance on the part of American society. We are avoiding the very work that we need to be doing in order to create public safety. And I feel that our public safety system, our public safety paradigm has to be rethought. It has to be recreated based on new foundations that face the tough realities that we've been avoiding for decades now. And 3 examples of what those work areas are. One, obviously, and the president mentioned this, is drug addiction. We are the largest drug market on planet Earth. But any kind of addiction treatment programs that we have are at the periphery of our public safety system. Second example that is really the reason that we're here tonight is our addiction to the manufacturing, purchasing, and carrying of guns. So we have, if you look at the gun manufacturing rates in our country, they have been skyrocketing in recent years, skyrocketing. And it says a lot, and this is why I think we need the on-the-ground local leadership, because all we got out of our national debate around gun control was increased purchasing of guns, which points to the insanity that Angela Davis was talking about. And then importantly, both of those issues, our addiction to illegal narcotics and our addiction to guns, are not in no way isolated to urban neighborhoods. Those issues, our rates of purchasing guns, our rates of purchasing drugs are higher in many suburbs than they are in many urban neighborhoods. What makes urban neighborhoods distinct is that the economy, a lot of things make urban neighborhoods distinct, but a couple are. One is that the economies have been wiped out to the point that the sale of drugs now represent a much larger percent of the economy. And two, and this is the real reason we're here tonight, is that guns are used against other humans at a higher rate, which is tied to drug sales, though that's not the only driver of it. So that points me to the third area of work aversion that I want to talk about. Since deindustrialization, since the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs, we have avoided really dealing with the breakdown of community fabric and the urban fabric that has followed in those decades. And instead, we've been focused on this insane prison expansion agenda that has dominated much of our public resources and energy since the early 1980s. But that issue of how do we rebuild community fabrics in the absence of Brock's Candy on the south side, on the west side, or the steel mills on the southeast side, how do we really do that? That work still awaits us. That is work that is awaiting for our generation right now. And that is one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate for restorative justice, is because while restorative justice can't solve the economic problems, it can't be the job creator, though we can create an industry of peace, but it's not going to solve our job creation problems. It can do a lot to repair the community fabric. There's a lot that we can do by sitting in circle with one another, by getting to know our neighbors, to redevelop relationships. And restorative justice really says that safety is a question of relationships. What I take from Angela pointing out that we have the highest prison rate in the world and that we have the highest gun purchasing rate in the world is that we don't know what the hell safety means to us. We don't know what it means. And what restorative justice says is that safety is about how we connect with one another. And then when our relationships are off, we are less safe. When our relationships are righteous, we are more safe. So if you want to look at the areas where we see young people shooting other young people, those are areas where the relationships are off. And fixing relationships is not as hard as fixing jobs. We could do that right now if we became dedicated to that enough. So let me talk a little bit about another side of this. So restorative justice is key to fixing the relationships. I do think we have to talk about the economic piece. And so in addition to restorative justice, or RJ, I want to talk about JR, or justice reinvestment. And that is the idea that we have to start moving money from our prisons to our communities. If you look at the areas where there's the most gun violence in our city, those are also the areas where there's the most state violence, as Miriam would say, or the highest incarceration areas. And when you combine the juvenile detention costs the president talked about with the juvenile incarceration costs of the Department of Juvenile Justice, with the cost of Cook County Jail, with the costs of the Illinois Department of Corrections, we're looking at $15 to $25 million in single zip codes a year in many of these neighborhoods. And that's money that is building up the economy of incarceration rather than the economy of peace. And so we have to switch that. And the last thing I'll say, and this is one of the things that is so beautiful about your work, Amina, and I appreciate your leadership at Ceasefire, and I hope that you are moved up in the ladder at Ceasefire amidst all the transition there, because we need that. And that outreach work is fundamental. We have to have outreach work. And the reason we have to have people like Amina who know how to build those relationships is because we have two very important messages to deliver. One is the message is that it is not acceptable for young people to be on a path that's going to lead to prison. That's not acceptable. The other message that we as progressives also have to deliver, and we can't leave alone to the police, is that it is not acceptable for young people to think that their brethren are their enemies and to shoot at one another. That is also not acceptable. That does not value black life or brown life in any way. So we have to deliver both of those messages at the same time, and you can't do that without the types of relationships that Amina, that Miriam, that Henry, that others build with young people. And the unified message is, your lives shall not be wasted. Your lives cannot be wasted. We have too many other problems in addition to gun violence where we need your leadership. We can't afford for those lives to be wasted or those lives to be taken prematurely from us. So I'll just say that, and I'll say that the more that we can invest, move those prison dollars into the outreach work, into the relationship building, into the healing work in these communities, the better off we're going to be.
We could listen to these guys all night long, couldn't we? But we only have a few minutes left, so we're not going to. I do want to say that, a couple interesting things that were said. Dr. Davis talked about the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And, we also celebrated recently the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And what I always, Ryan, you mentioned, how we need to move forward a little bit. And what I always just like to remind people is that the title of that march was a March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Jobs and freedom. It was all about economics and moving to that point. I'm going to ask just a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up. We'll only have time for just a couple of questions from the audience. But Board President Precwinkle, you talked about the status of the prison system in Cook County and the Juvenile Detention Center. And when I was studying up for tonight, I read a Cook County Juvenile Task Force report that talked about, what it would like to see. And so I'd like you to start off, but other folks to join in, because that task force talked about, it proposed what it called restorative justice hubs. Restorative justice hubs, which were community centers that would address the needs of young people who perpetrate crimes while also supporting community residents and victims of crimes. And I was wondering, thinking about the system that we have now, even though the number of juveniles being incarcerated has gone down in Cook County, is it really possible to create a neighborhood-based juvenile justice system, and is there the wherewithal to do something like that?
Well, thank you, Cheryl. First of all, let me say that we've made a real effort to reduce the number of young people in the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, the JTDC. Our goal was to bring it down from about 300 on a daily basis, closer to 250. Frankly, policing strategies in Chicago prevented us from doing that. But we do have the cooperation of the actors in the juvenile justice system to de-emphasize the JTDC as a way of dealing with people who come into the juvenile system. Let me just say, it costs $143 a day to keep someone in the adult jail. It costs us about $600 a day to keep someone in the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, because we have to provide for their education as well as their shelter and food. So it's a very expensive proposition, and 43% of the young people who are there for 2 weeks or less. And my argument is that anyone who's in the JTDC for two weeks or less really isn't a danger to themselves or their community. And we need to be looking for community-based alternatives to detention there. We've put resources into intensive supervision of young people who come into the system rather than putting them in the JTDC. so that they are picked up after school, they're taken to a community-based center, they get tutoring and behavioral health support and recreational opportunities until 9 or 10 at night. Likewise, picked up on the weekends. They spent the entire weekend at these community-based centers as an alternative to putting them in the juvenile jail. So they stay in their home, they stay in their school, and hopefully they are able to make changes in their lives that I said will lead them on a path to productivity rather than into the adult criminal justice system. And you have to understand that the deeper you penetrate the criminal justice system as a juvenile, the more likely you are to end up in jail as an adult. So whatever we can do to keep kids out of the JTDC, we ought to do, and we're trying to shift our resources in that direction. But let me just say that we in the county are the recipients of people who come in contact with police and local communities. And I'm not sure about the numbers for our juvenile temporary detention center, but for our adult jail, 80% of the people in our jail are from Chicago, and Chicago's half the population of the county. So policing strategies in Chicago have a tremendous impact on both the JTDC and our adult jail.
I want to throw some numbers at you and have somebody pick this up. Chicago's murder rate dropped dramatically this year, as I mentioned, even lower than 2011. Shootings, but fatal and non-fatal were down 25%. By the first week of this month, September, this sounds like a terrible number to me, was 258 killed by guns, but that was much lower than it was last year and the year before. Now, Superintendent McCarthy, the head of police, says it may be because of some things he's trying. I'll get you guys to weigh in on that. Neighborhood saturations, gang reduction strategy finally in place, trying to return to community policing. But he also says that Chicago is just awash in guns. Dr. Davis talked about the number of guns in the country. The superintendent and the mayor talk about the city of Chicago. The police department seizes more guns each year than any other police department in the United States. So now Police Superintendent McCarthy says, well, you know, what we need to do is have a state law that calls for a mandatory 3-year sentence for felony illegal gun possession. And we need to have a truth in sentencing provision requiring defendants to serve 85% of their prison terms. He says that almost 100 people in Chicago would have been in prison this year under such a law, but instead were out on the street to become shooters or victims. So, you all talk about our connections, right? So, how do you think police should be engaged as part of a strategy with communities? Should there be some kind of combination of the McCarthy approach and some of the approaches that you were talking about?
All right, let me speak first to mandatory minimums. I was very pleased that Eric Holder, our Attorney General, finally spoke out on the issue of mandatory sentences for drug offenses. His rationale was that they don't work, and my argument would be that we've got to deal with substance abuse in this country in our public health system and not in our criminal justice system. But I'm opposed to mandatory minimums. I think they're like 3-strike laws. This is a terrible idea, and we've done everything and we can in Springfield to keep Illinois from enacting mandatory minimums.
We have a lot of head nodding here from Miriam, and you, but you've talked a lot about how the police, she's not touching this one, come on.
As a violence interrupter and working with the organization, my goal is to educate not just the young guys and girls that we deal with that we call the highest risk, as far as those that have been shot, will be shot, have been engaged in juvenile detention or incarcerated with in the state law. But my goal is to educate law enforcement as well, that there's other issues that a young guy and girl may be dealing with that you need to take a look at other than slamming them up against the car or giving them a case or whatever. So we've had an opportunity to partner with the city of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel decided to partner with Cure Violence and one of the highest areas of Lawndale and right outside of Parkways on 63rd and King Drive in that area of B313 and that has been a reduction. So, and I'm not here to bash the police that's not my goal. My goal is for us to educate ourselves, for one, for two, educate our young guys and girls, for three, because when we do know better, we do better. If we do know, and what you just read, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see or hear what the setup and the design is already put in place for. So therefore, you need to stop, drop, and roll because there's a fire and we need to get out of that fire safe. So that's what I would say to our young guys and our young girls, and what I do say to the police is, if you do look at statistics, they may not give the partners that we work with the credit that is well needed to get these young guys to stop shooting at each other, that they're the enemy against each other. That is not a true factor, and that is how we educate our young guys about that. So we have to educate our young guys, even though they may have had a juvenile offense or whatever, but we have to educate them about the laws. They don't know about gun laws. They don't know about once they get into that car and they're down into the district, what their name, and then they can be released to their family. They don't know what is going on and why their name is in the system and how they're getting knocked back 15 years on something simple or minor. So it is my job and my goal to educate.
Okay.
You know, that's what, I don't want to bash or,
Okay.
I'm not here to do
Well,
that.
no, my question is not about bashing, it's about, how do you, they're obviously a big part of what's happening on the street. Ryan, you wanted to join in?
I do want to hop in. So the two sayings that are key from the restorative justice community in Chicago. One is, if you've come here to help, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound to mine, then let us work together. And I think that is the question that I would ask police is, are you here to help, or are you here because our freedom is actually interwoven? And I'm not saying all police are ready to hear that question, but I do believe that some are. And another, because I think unless you actually believe that you are connected to the people in the neighborhoods that you're serving, then you're never going to be able to fulfill the objectives of serving and protecting. So the other key saying though is that hurt people hurt people. And when you look at, and one of the implications of that is that healing is prevention. If we can do the work of healing, then we can prevent violence in the future. And that also applies to police officers. If you look at the police force, their rates of suicide, of alcoholism, of divorce are astronomical. And so they have a lot of pain that that gets projected onto the people that they're supposed to be protecting and serving. And we have to heal that hurt as well as the hurt that's urban neighborhoods if we're really going to create a transformation. So I think that it's key to see police as part of the solution, but we have to set our standards for what their behavior should look like.
All right. Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question? If not, I will move on. Yes, right here. What's your name? Karen Bond. Yes, thank you. Does everybody hear the question? Okay, the question was essentially how is the media covering what they do? And secondly, what would they wish the media to do as they cover their work and the work of people who do work on nonviolence? Or different? Anyone?
It's very hard to get the media to talk about disparities in our criminal justice system. It's very hard to get the media to talk about the disparities in our criminal justice system. Again, 99% of the young people in the JTDC are black and brown. 86% of the people in our adult jail are black and brown. So that's something, that's not common knowledge. And when I talk about the criminal justice system, I always talk about, as I said, the intersection of racism and poverty. And that the facts about our system are a surprise to a lot of people. And that's discouraging because that's basic information that the media could easily convey to people, but is not often accessible.
Mariam?
For me, the key around media and media representation is the representation of people in communities as agents rather than as subjects and victims. The notion that, when people are, one of my biggest pet peeves is the constant refrain that I hear from people who actually aren't actually doing anything themselves about where's the outrage? Why aren't people pissed off? Why aren't people working, right? And part of the problem is the media is not actually showing the stories of all the people in every community that I know of that are working every single day, usually for $0 or minus $0 to be able to actually support our kids. Right? Because no one is getting rich doing this work. And it's only when you are actually somebody who's in the neighborhood working every day that I know what everybody is doing. I know Amina's down on the south side working her butt off, right? I know what Brian's doing at his work. I know what Henry's doing in Pilsen. And so that's the frustration, is that the sense is that there's somehow complete and utter nothingness happening. Our communities are just these vacuum places where nothing is happening and where people aren't taking care of business every single day with $0. It's really hard to live and work if you are somebody who's living on public assistance and food stamps, to raise children, put them into school, do all the things you're doing, right? When rich people can't take care of their own business and they have all the resources available to them. So I just feel like the media needs to focus on that.
Well, we have absolutely run out of time, unfortunately. But what? What? Okay, over here.
I can project. So, Dr. Davis mentioned, you spoke about how during the inauguration in 2009, there was no crime in D.C. I actually was there. I had hustled up some money and went there looking for hope. I was homeless teen in Chicago, just still trying to push through. And I did notice that there was no violence, none whatsoever. This year, a couple weeks ago, I was with the BYP 100, and we was in D.C. for the March on Washington. And one thing that I noticed, and I kept telling all of my brothers and sisters of BYP 100 is, this feeling is a lot different than how it was in 2009. People were charged, they believed in something, and I felt like the March on Washington this year was very historic in the sense that it was 50 years, but there was I didn't see a fire or, a push for change. I didn't feel like people knew exactly why they were there. And so my thing is, how do we, all the people in this panel who are dedicated, I know you all from different walks of life, dedicated to, bettering our communities, where do we get that fire again? And I'm saying, the youth have it, some of them, right? But how do we make that momentum? It was like a utopia
Hold on just a second. Everybody hear it? Yeah. How you bring the fire? How do you bring the fire?
Can you hear me? Because I really don't need a microphone.
Oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do.
As I said earlier when I opened up, this is a movement. This is a movement. Yeah, the first inauguration felt different because we had a lot at stake. This is the last time that brother's gonna be in office, right? And his clock is ticking. So therefore, as a movement, if it's teachers or if it's media in this room, as we have Sister Cheryl here, we have the president here, it's time to, put one on blast on what is not happening, as the sister said, lack of resources in our community, where our young guys and girls look at the city of Chicago that is beautiful. When you look straight to the east and back, it looks beautiful. You're in a vibrant city, but if you go 10 blocks from that, I'm in a church, I gotta remember. It's a whole different look and a whole different feel. So what I need to do, and what you all need to do, is to make it a known fact that what is priority in our city, in our own house, in our own country, that's what is different than the first 4 years. That what was priority is not priority as it feels to be. Because for me, my heart goes out to the brothers and sisters that lost their lives and their children when it was in Newtown. But we have Newtown. I work Newtown, Inglewood every day. Every single day, we're losing brothers and sisters. We have them in Roseland. We have it in back of the yards in Humboldt Park. We have it in, and so when we talk about what is needed as the clock is ticking, my young brothers and sisters, and I'll be right beside you, because we have right here a president that is willing to fight for our young brothers and sisters to stay on the streets and get education. So therefore, when we have that powerful resource, and we have this powerful resource, and we have this powerful resource, and we got this powerful resource of our mouth and actions. See, one thing my dad always used to say, word without works is dead. We can talk all night long, but until we do work and have action at it, then that's when we're gonna have change of the judicial system and mass incarceration. That's when we're gonna start having public assistance help young guys and girls get job ready and where we can be able to sustain without our young brothers thinking that they gotta take something from somebody for their families to sustain. I wanna say one thing, and when we used to drive down 87th and you know those little kids that be hitting the buckets? You know, I followed 3 of those young guys, the bucket boys, they called them, right? And they would ask for dollars, and they would ask for 50 cents, and they would show their skills on the little paint buckets. I followed them, and the only way that they was using that money, it wasn't about, we can talk about substance abuse, that's 1. We can talk about post-traumatic syndrome, that's 2. We can talk about lack of education in the school system, that's 3. Police brutality, all of that. But those young cats was drumming to feed their mothers and feed their young sisters and brothers, and they wasn't nothing but 13 and 12. So as we have a venue right now, this symposium, as Brother Rob, he died before this was able to unfold. It's a beautiful thing that we can move on, and we can move on now because the clock is ticking. That brother is on his way up out of there. And there's some things that, as a people, we need to ask, and we can ask, but we need to tell them what we need in our city of Chicago, which is beautiful, that the haves can meet the have-nots instead of take from the haves.
Thank you, thank you. I just want to say 2 things before we close. Whenever we talk about youth violence and guns in the city of Chicago and in the country, especially when we talk to young black people and brown people, it's often a downgrade. you know, you ought to do this, this is what's happening, you haven't done this, blah, blah, blah. And so I want us to applaud the young people who are here tonight who are working to make a difference. And the second thing that I would like to do as we close this portion of the program is to remember some of the words that Dr. Davis said in her address when she talked about violence precluding the future for a lot of young people. We heard from not only her, but from our panel about how many young people who are involved in violence just don't think about the future because they don't think they're going to be around. So we have a wonderful, wonderful panel tonight. As I said, a very determined people who are here and who work in the community and on the street to inspire people and to turn that message around, to tell young people that there is a future, there is a way, there is time for them not to be involved in violence. So thank you to our panel of inspirers.